My name is Claire Whitfield. I am 34 years old, and at 8:23 on a Thursday evening, I heard my mother say to my father, "Once the landlord files, she'll have 72 hours before she understands she has nowhere else to go." To my father, who replied, "Good," in the kitchen of the house I grew up in, while they believed I was still sitting in my car in the driveway, finishing a phone call that had ended 4 minutes earlier. I had come inside through the side door because the porch light was out. I was standing in the hallway between the laundry room and the kitchen in socks because I had taken my shoes off on the mat the way I had done since I was 6 years old. The hallway tile was cold. I remember that. I remember the hum of the refrigerator compressor cycling on and the smell of the lemon dish soap my mother had used for as long as I could remember. And I remember the specific way my father said, "Good," not with malice, not with satisfaction, but with the flat administrative tone of a man confirming that a shipment had arrived on schedule. My hands were holding a Tupperware container of soup I had brought them, chicken and rice, still warm against my palms. I did not move. I did not set the container down. I stood there holding it, while my breathing became something I controlled manually, the way I controlled it during equipment inspections when a pressure reading came back outside tolerance, and the next 30 seconds determined whether I issued a shutdown order or noted a variance. I was already running the numbers. 72 hours. The landlord. A filing. My mother had said once, not if. This was not a discussion about whether to act. This was a progress report on something already in motion. I work as a boiler and pressure vessel inspector for a regional insurance carrier. I have been doing this for 9 years. My job is to enter facilities, refineries, hospitals, food processing plants, university steam plants, and determine whether the equipment people depend on every day is going to hold or whether it is going to fail in a way that kills someone. I examine welds, read gauge calibrations, check certification dates, cross-reference maintenance logs against actual operating conditions. I am trained to notice the single data point that does not belong. A weld bead that is slightly too convex. A log entry dated on a Sunday when the facility was closed. A pressure relief valve rated for a system that was upgraded 2 years ago but never recertified. Most people walk past these things every day. I do not walk past them. That skill had kept industrial systems honest for nearly a decade. It was about to do the same thing to my own family. But I am not here to talk to my parents. Not really. They will hear this eventually, or they will not. What I am here to do is talk to you. Before I tell you what I found when I started looking, what time is it where you are? I want to know how many people heard something they recognized in that opening. Because if you have ever walked into a room where the people who were supposed to love you were calmly planning something designed to break you, then you already know what that hallway tile felt like under my feet. I need to go back. Not to the hallway, to the years that built it. My parents, Roger and Diane Whitfield, owned a small commercial cleaning company that serviced office buildings in 3 counties. They started it the year I was born and grew it steadily. By the time I was in high school, they employed 14 people and had contracts with 2 municipal buildings. They were proud of this. My father talked about the business the way some men talk about a firstborn son, with a possessiveness that left no room for anyone else's contribution to matter equally. My mother managed the books and client relationships. She was good at it. She was good at making people feel seen, while quietly ensuring that every arrangement served the family's interests first. I was the younger of 2 children. My brother, Kevin, was 4 years older, and from the time I was old enough to notice, the family operated on a principle so consistent it might as well have been written into the company bylaws. Kevin received investment. Claire received expectations. When Kevin wanted to switch colleges, my parents paid the transfer fees and the lost credit tuition without discussion. When I needed new steel-toed boots for my first inspection internship, my mother suggested I ask my supervisor whether the company provided them. When Kevin's wedding reception went $12,000 over budget, my father laughed and called it a celebration. When I asked for help with the security deposit on my first apartment, $900. My father sat me down and explained that financial independence was the foundation of character. I paid it myself. I did not argue. I did not point out the asymmetry. I filed it the way I file a gauge reading that sits just inside the acceptable range. Noted, logged, not yet actionable. The irony is that I spent my entire professional life evaluating whether systems were operating within safe parameters. I could look at a steam header and tell you within minutes whether the maintenance logs matched the actual condition of the equipment. But I lived inside a family system that had been running over pressure for 30 years, and every time the relief valve lifted, I told myself it was just cycling normally. 3 years before the hallway, I lost my job at a manufacturing plant, not through any fault of mine, but because the plant closed. I was between positions for 5 months. During that time, my parents offered no financial help, but called weekly to ask whether I had found anything yet. Each call ended with my mother saying, "You know you can always come home if you need to regroup." The offer sounded generous. What it meant was that returning home came with conditions: helping with the business, attending church with them on Sundays, submitting to my father's opinions about what kind of work was appropriate for a woman, and accepting that Kevin's needs would be prioritized because he had a family. I found a new position on my own. I did not go home, and the weekly calls became monthly, then quarterly, and my mother began telling relatives that I had become distant and difficult. 8 months before the hallway, I was laid off again. The insurance carrier I worked for lost a major client and reduced its inspection staff. This time I had savings, 4 months of expenses, and I had already begun networking, but I made the mistake of telling my parents during a Sunday dinner. My father set his fork down slowly, not with anger, but with the careful precision of a man who had been waiting for something to confirm what he already believed. "This is the second time," he said. "At some point, you have to ask yourself whether the pattern is the industry or the person," my mother added, without looking up from her plate. Kevin never had this problem. Kevin worked for the family business. Kevin had never had an employer who could fire him. I said nothing. I finished my dinner. I drove home. 6 weeks before the hallway, I had not yet found a new full-time position, but I had secured contract inspection work through a former colleague. I was earning enough to cover rent and essentials. I was not comfortable, but I was not in crisis. I told my parents this during a phone call. My mother's response was, "Contract work is not a career, Claire. It's what people do when they cannot find real employment." I said I disagreed. She said, "We are worried about you." That phrase, "we are worried about you," had been deployed my entire life to mean, "We disapprove of a choice you have made, and we would like you to replace it with ours." Then I was in the hallway, holding soup. My mother continued talking after the word I had already heard. She told my father that the landlord, a man named Dennis Pratt, who owned the duplex I rented, had agreed to file a notice of lease termination based on a clause about the landlord's intent to renovate. She said they had offered him $1,000 to initiate the process immediately. My father asked whether Dennis understood that I might fight it. My mother said, "She won't. She doesn't have the money for a lawyer, and she doesn't have anywhere else to go. She'll call us within the week." My father said, "Make sure Kevin doesn't hear about the money. He'll want to know why we're spending on her." That last sentence landed differently than anything else, not because it was the cruelest thing said, because it revealed the accounting. In my parents' system, money spent on me was an expenditure that required justification. Money spent on Kevin was infrastructure. I stood there for a long time. The soup container had cooled against my hands. Something inside me became perfectly still, not calm, not resolved, but still the way a gauge needle becomes still when it reaches the limit of its range and has nowhere else to travel. I was calculating. Dennis Pratt owned my duplex. My lease ran for another 9 months. A renovation clause existed, but Oregon law required specific written notice, a genuine intent to renovate, and compliance with relocation assistance requirements. My parents did not know I knew this. My parents did not know I was standing 12 feet away. I set the soup on the washing machine. I walked back out the side door. I put my shoes on. I drove home. I did not call them. I did not confront Dennis. I opened my laptop, pulled up my lease, and read every clause with the same attention I give to a boiler's nameplate data. Then I opened a new folder on my desktop and named it Inspection File, Whitfield. The next morning, Dennis Pratt called me. His voice had the overly friendly quality of a man who had rehearsed what he was about to say. "Claire, I've been thinking about the property, and I've decided to do some significant renovation work on your unit. I'm going to need you to start looking for a new place." He said it as though he were doing me a favor by giving me advance notice, as though this were a scheduling matter between reasonable adults. I said, "I'd like that in writing, Dennis. Certified mail or email is fine." He hesitated. "I can send you something. Include the specific renovations planned, the projected timeline, and the applicable lease clause you're invoking. I'll need it for my records." He agreed, sounding less certain than when he had started the call. I thanked him and hung up. Then I sat at my kitchen table and began documenting. Over the next 2 weeks, I did what I do professionally. I inspected. I pulled my rental payment records for the prior 3 years, every payment on time. I photographed the condition of my unit inside and out, dated and time-stamped. I requested the property's permit history from the county planning office because if Dennis intended to renovate, he would need permits, and permits left records. There were no permit applications on file, none pending, none in the previous 18 months. Dennis sent me an email, not certified mail, stating that he planned to upgrade plumbing and electrical systems throughout the building and invoking Section 14.2 of my lease, which allowed termination for substantial renovation requiring vacancy. I read the email 3 times. Then I read Section 14.2 again. The clause required 90 days written notice, not the 30 Dennis had given me. It required documentation of the planned renovation scope, and under Oregon's landlord-tenant statutes, it required relocation assistance equal to 1 month's rent. Dennis had provided none of these. I called the county building department and asked whether any contractor had pulled permits for the address. The clerk checked and confirmed, no permits, no applications, no pre-application consultations. The building had not been flagged for any renovation work. Layer 1 was the surface insult, my parents paying my landlord to force me out. Layer 2 was the deliberate architecture beneath it. Dennis's email had been coached. The clause he cited was almost correct. Almost. He had the section number right. He had the language approximately right. But the notice period was wrong. The documentation was absent, and no permits existed. Someone had told him what to write without actually reading the lease carefully. Someone who managed contracts for a cleaning company and was accustomed to issuing termination notices to employees, not navigating residential tenancy law. My mother's fingerprints were on that email, the way a signature is on a weld, invisible to anyone who had not been trained to look for the operator's habits. I spent 3 weeks after that night building what I am about to show you. But before I do, where are you watching from? Leave it below. I want to see how many rooms this story reaches. Cold math moment number 2 came on a Saturday morning. I was sitting on my kitchen floor with my laptop, cross-referencing my parents' cleaning company's public business filings with the property records for Dennis Pratt's duplex. I found it almost by accident, the way I once found a fracture in a boiler tube, by noticing that the surface discoloration pattern did not match the reported operating temperature. Dennis Pratt's duplex was listed in county records under his name, but the previous owner, who had sold it to Dennis 6 years earlier, was a limited liability company called RDW Property Holdings. RDW. Roger and Diane Whitfield. My parents had owned my building. They had sold it to Dennis before I moved in. The sale price was $43,000 below the assessed value. and the cleaning contract for the small office building Dennis managed, the one that had been my parents' client for 8 years, had been renewed the same month as the property sale, at terms unusually favorable to Dennis. My parents had not just paid Dennis $1,000 to evict me, they had structured a years-long financial relationship with the man who controlled my housing. The $1,000 was not the bribe, it was the latest installment. I printed everything, I organized it chronologically, and then I found the oldest layer. In the company's archived tax filings, which Kevin had once forwarded to me years ago when I helped him with a question about deductions, and which I had never deleted from my email, there was a depreciation schedule listing RDW Property Holdings as a subsidiary. The duplex had originally been purchased with company funds. My parents had used their business to buy the property, sold it to a cooperative landlord at a loss, maintained the relationship through a favorable contract, and then, when they needed leverage over me, activated that relationship with a $1,000 payment. This was not a reaction to my job loss. This was infrastructure. My brother Kevin had no idea about any of this, or so I believed until I checked something. The email Kevin had sent me with the tax filings, the one I had never deleted, included a note at the bottom I had never read carefully. It said, "Mom asked me to send you last year's filing for your records. She said you might need the property schedule someday." That was 5 years ago. My mother had arranged for me to have the very document that would later become evidence, not because she wanted me to find anything, because she believed I would never look. I called one person, not my parents, not Kevin. I called a woman named Trudy Salcedo. Trudy was a retired housing code enforcement officer who had spent 31 years inspecting residential properties in our county. I had met her at a professional conference 3 years earlier, and we had stayed in touch because we shared the same approach to documentation: thorough, dated, and stored in triplicate. I told Trudy what I had found. Not the family history, just the facts: a landlord invoking a renovation clause with no permits, an insufficient notice period, no relocation assistance, and a financial relationship with third parties who had paid him to initiate the termination. Trudy was quiet for 10 seconds. Then she said, "That's not a renovation notice. That's a constructive eviction with extra steps." "Do you have it all in writing?" I did. Trudy connected me with a tenant rights attorney named Martin Huerta. Martin reviewed my documentation in 2 days and confirmed that Dennis had violated the notice requirements, the relocation assistance statute, and potentially the state's anti-retaliation provisions. He also noted that the financial relationship between my parents and Dennis, the below-market property sale, the favorable cleaning contract, the $1,000 payment, could constitute a coordinated effort to interfere with my tenancy. He told me this was not a gray area. I did not warn my parents. I did not call Dennis. I filed a formal complaint with the County Housing Authority and retained Martin to send Dennis a demand letter. The letter did not mention my parents. It simply stated the legal deficiencies in his termination notice and demanded that he withdraw it, confirm my lease in writing, and provide the relocation assistance he had failed to offer. Dennis called me 40 minutes after receiving it. His voice was different now, smaller. "Claire, I think there's been a misunderstanding." "There hasn't," I said. "Respond to the letter." My parents' cleaning company held its annual client appreciation dinner every January at a restaurant called Birch and Iron, a place my father had chosen specifically because 2 local council members ate there regularly. He liked being seen hosting. He liked the room. He treated that dinner the way some people treat a living room, as proof of who they had become. This year, the dinner fell 11 days after Martin's letter reached Dennis. I attended. I had been invited months earlier, back when my parents still believed I was someone who would be managed quietly. I wore a gray blazer and carried a slim folder. My mother greeted me at the entrance with a hug that lasted exactly long enough to look warm. "I'm glad you came," she said. "We've been worried." Roger and Diane Whitfield, my parents, sat at the head table with Kevin, Kevin's wife Laura, 2 long-term clients, and Dennis Pratt. Dennis was seated at the far end, which told me my parents had not yet heard from him about the letter. They still believed the plan was proceeding. Dinner was served. My father stood to give his annual remarks. Gratitude, community, the importance of relationships built on trust. I watched Dennis shift in his chair. Kevin laughed at our father's jokes. My mother surveyed the room the way she always did, accounting for every face, every reaction, every potential disruption. After dessert, my father invited informal conversation. I waited until the table had settled into smaller groups. Then I walked to where Dennis was sitting, placed the folder on the table in front of him, and sat down across from him. My mother noticed immediately. She stood. My father paused mid-sentence. "Dennis," I said, "I'd like to discuss the renovation you're planning for my unit." He looked at the folder. He looked at my mother. "This isn't really the place. You filed a termination notice against my lease. This is exactly the place." My father stepped closer. "Claire, we're not going to do this here." My mother added, "You're embarrassing yourself." I opened the folder. Inside was a copy of Dennis's termination email, the county's confirmation that no permits had been filed, the Oregon statute on required notice periods, the relocation assistance provision he had not complied with, and on the final page, the payment confirmation for $1,000 from a personal account linked to Roger Whitfield, with the memo line reading, "Property Consulting." Dennis said, "I was told this was a family arrangement." My father said, "This is a private matter between us and our daughter." My mother turned to Kevin. "She's doing this because she can't accept help gracefully." Kevin, to his credit, said nothing. He stared at the table. I laid the property records on the surface. The original purchase through RDW Property Holdings. The below-market sale to Dennis. The cleaning contract renewal. The timeline showing the relationship had been structured over 6 years. "You didn't just pay him to evict me," I said. "You built the system that made it possible." My father's face changed. Not anger, something closer to recognition. The look of a man who has just realized the inspection is not routine. "You went through company records." "I went through public filings. Everything on this table is available to anyone who checks." My mother tried a different approach. She softened. "Claire, we were trying to help you. You lost your job twice. We thought if you came home for a while. You paid someone to take my housing, so I would have no choice but to come to you. That is not help, that is leverage." Dennis stood up and said he needed to leave. Martin Huerta, whom I had asked to be in the restaurant that evening, seated at a separate table, eating dinner like any other patron, approached and introduced himself. "Mr. Pratt, I'm representing Ms. Whitfield regarding the lease matter. I'd recommend you stay for a few minutes." My father looked at Martin, then at me. "You brought a lawyer to a family dinner?" "You brought my landlord to one." My mother said to the room at large, "She has always been like this. She cannot let anything go." One of the long-term clients, a man named Arthur Embry, who managed facilities for the county school district and had known my parents for 15 years, set down his napkin. He had been listening. "Diane," he said carefully, "did you actually pay this man to remove your daughter from her apartment?" My mother did not answer. Arthur looked at my father. "Roger, I've sent you contracts for 12 years, based on the assumption that your business dealings are straightforward. What am I looking at here?" That was the confirming weight. Not a witness I had planted, not someone on my side. A client. A man whose trust funded their business, asking the question my parents could not dismiss because his contracts paid their mortgage. My father tried once more. "Arthur, families go through difficulties. This has been exaggerated." I said one sentence. "My parents do not solve problems. They purchase the conditions that leave you no choice but to accept their terms." Then I closed the folder and said nothing else. The room was quiet for a long time. Laura, Kevin's wife, whispered something to Kevin. Kevin stood and walked outside without speaking. Dennis sat back down heavily. My mother reached for her water glass and missed it slightly, her fingers closing on air before finding the rim. Martin handed Dennis a formal response letter and advised him to consult his own attorney. Arthur Embry excused himself, folded his napkin precisely, and left the restaurant. He did not shake my father's hand. Within 3 weeks, Dennis withdrew the termination notice, confirmed my lease in writing through his attorney, and agreed to a settlement that included rent credit for the months of disruption, reimbursement of my legal costs, and a commitment to complete any future lease actions in strict compliance with Oregon law. His attorney told Martin that Dennis wanted it on record that he had been misled about the family situation. Martin noted the statement but did not pursue Dennis further. He was a small man who had made a small choice for a small amount of money. Arthur Embry did not renew his cleaning contract. He sent a polite letter, citing a change in procurement direction. Within 2 months, my parents lost a second client, a medical office whose administrator had heard about the dinner from Arthur's assistant. The dominoes were not dramatic. They were administrative, but each one carried revenue my parents had counted on. Kevin called me 9 days after the dinner. He spoke carefully, the way he always did when he was trying to be decent without contradicting our parents. "I didn't know about the payment," he said. "I knew they wanted you to come home. I didn't know they were forcing it." I asked whether he knew about the property sale to Dennis. He was quiet. Then, "I knew they sold a property a while back. I didn't connect it to your building." I believed him partially. Kevin's gift had always been strategic in curiosity, knowing exactly how much not to know in order to remain comfortable. I told him I appreciated the call and that I needed space. He said he understood. 2 weeks later, he sent me a text. "I told Dad that what he did was wrong. He said I was being influenced by you." A month after that, Kevin quietly began asking Laura to review the cleaning company's finances, something he had never done. He found expense entries he could not explain. He did not confront our parents. He did not tell me, but Laura mentioned it to me during an unrelated conversation. Kevin was beginning his own inspection, his own process. I did not push. That work was his. My mother sent a letter, handwritten, on her personal stationery, that said she had acted out of love and fear for my future. The letter contained no acknowledgement of the payment, the coordination with Dennis, or the property history. It asked me to move forward as a family. I did not respond. My father never contacted me directly. He told Kevin I had declared war on the family. He told extended relatives that I had humiliated them publicly over a misunderstanding. None of these relatives called me to ask what had actually happened. Silence is easy to maintain when someone else has already provided the explanation you would prefer to believe. Martin filed a formal complaint about the financial coordination between my parents and Dennis with the state's Real Estate Regulatory Board. The complaint triggered a review of the below-market property sale and the associated cleaning contract. My parents were required to provide documentation of the transaction's terms. The documentation they produced was incomplete. The board opened an investigation that would take months, but the fact of the investigation itself became a matter of professional record. My father's name appeared in a regulatory database for the first time. For a man who had built his identity on being trusted, the entry was more damaging than any fine. 6 months after the dinner at Birch and Iron, I sat for the National Board exam for pressure equipment inspectors, a certification I had postponed 3 times. Twice because of job transitions, once because my mother had called the week before the exam to tell me my father was having chest pains and needed someone to drive him to appointments. The chest pains turned out to be acid reflux. The exam window closed. I did not reschedule for 2 years. This time, I studied for 11 weeks, took the exam on a Saturday morning in a community college testing center that smelled like floor wax, and passed. The certificate arrived in a white envelope. I opened it at my kitchen table, the same table where I had cross-referenced property records on my kitchen floor months earlier. I read my full name printed in block letters above the certification number. It was not a victory. It was a thing I had earned that no one had delayed, redirected, or made conditional. Kevin completed his own quiet review of the company's books. What he found led him to hire an outside accountant. What the accountant found led Kevin to request a formal family meeting, not at Birch and Iron, not at my parents' home, but at the accountant's office. I was not present. Kevin later told me that our father sat in silence for most of the meeting and that our mother cried. The accountant had identified years of personal expenses routed through the business, including payments toward Kevin's mortgage that Kevin had not known were company funds. Kevin told our father that the business needed an independent financial manager, or Kevin would resign and report the discrepancies to their bonding company. Our father agreed. Kevin called me the evening after that meeting. His voice sounded different, tired but clear. "I spent my whole life thinking they gave me things because they believed in me," he said. "They gave me things because it kept me from asking questions." I said nothing for a while. Then, "Welcome to the inspection." On a Thursday evening, 13 months after I had stood in that hallway holding warm soup, I made chicken and rice in my own kitchen. I ate it at my table, alone, by choice. The apartment was quiet, the lease was mine. The certification was framed on the wall next to the door. My parents' names did not appear on any document in my home. The soup was the same recipe. The bowl was different, one I had bought at a second-hand store because I liked the color. The meal was ordinary. Nothing about it was symbolic to anyone except me, and I did not need anyone else to understand what it meant. Consequences are strange things when they arrive, not as punishment but as arithmetic. My parents did not lose their business. They lost control of it. They did not lose their family. They lost the ability to define its terms unilaterally. My father still manages crews. My mother still sends invoices, but an independent financial manager reviews every expenditure, and Kevin, who once never questioned a receipt, now reads every line. The regulatory investigation concluded with a finding of improper disclosure on the property sale. The fine was modest, the record was permanent. Dennis Pratt sold the duplex 18 months after the confrontation. The new owner honored my lease without incident. I never learned whether Dennis sold because of the regulatory scrutiny or because he simply wanted distance from the arrangement that had made the building feel less like property and more like evidence. There is something I have come to understand about what people say when they believe no one is listening. It is not that they become different people. It is that they stop performing the version of themselves they have decided you deserve to see. My mother did not become cruel in that kitchen. She was being precise. She was solving a logistics problem: how to move an uncooperative daughter from independence back into a system where compliance could be monitored and rewarded. She did not consider that I might be standing 12 feet away because she had already decided I was not a variable in the equation. I was the object being moved. Objects do not overhear. What I learned in that hallway was not that my parents did not love me. I believe, in their own accounting, they did. What I learned was that their love operated like a closed system, pressurized, controlled, and designed to function only under conditions they set. When I operated outside those parameters, I was not a daughter making choices. I was a failure in the system. And their instinct was not to understand the failure. It was to increase the pressure until the system performed the way they expected. I had spent my career identifying that exact pattern in machines. The difference was that machines do not plan. They fail according to physics. People fail according to what they have decided they are entitled to. My mother, Roger and Diane, I want to make sure you understand something, not because I need you to agree, because I want the record to be accurate. You said she'll have 72 hours before she understands she has nowhere else to go. You were wrong about the 72 hours. You were wrong about nowhere else. And you were wrong about what I would understand. What I understood, standing in that hallway, was that I had been living inside a system that treated my stability as a threat to your authority. And the only inspection that mattered was the one I had been refusing to perform. On the evening I passed my certification exam, I drove home a longer way than necessary. I passed the street where my parents' house sat. The porch light was on. They had fixed it. I did not stop. I did not slow down. I turned my own porch light on when I got home and left it burning all night, not for anyone. For the door. If the people in your life spoke about you the way my parents spoke about me, when they believed no one was listening, what would you hear? And more importantly, would you already know? This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, education, and dramatic reflection. We hope it reminded you that your dignity is not negotiable, and that setting a boundary, even a painful one, can be an act of love for yourself and everyone the pattern would have reached next.